Hello and welcome to Mind on the Move. I'm Saqib and this is my 10th video. I would really like to thank all the subscribers up to this point. I'm grateful for all your support. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at in-house movements versus off-the-shelf movements. I'll be looking at them both in detail and give my opinion as to whether one is inherently better than the other. Before we dig any deeper, what do both of these mean? What is an in-house movement? Well, as the term suggests, in-house watch movements are movements which are produced in-house. This means inside of the watch manufacturer's premises or factories. The generally accepted definition in the watch industry is that the movements should be developed, designed, manufactured and assembled by the same company that is manufacturing the watch itself. It seems quite straightforward, although is it? While the definition is quite clear, there's still room for interpretation. For example, does every single component of the watch movement need to be produced in-house by the watch manufacturer? If not, what's the percentage of the components that have to be produced in-house? The rules and requirements for a watch to be called Swiss-made are strict and well-defined. But the same cannot be said for in-house watch movements. The fact is that vast majority of companies that make in-house movements still source some of the components from other manufacturers. These parts may just be too complicated to make or simply just too expensive for the watch manufacturer to produce. Even Rolex was sourcing their hairsprings until the year 2000 from a company called Nivarox, which is under the Swatch Group. For a pure in-house caliber, every single component of the movement needs to be fully developed, decorated, assembled by the employees of that particular watch company. But the fact of the matter is that in today's market, it is very rare to find a 100% in-house manufactured movement. Now, what is an off-the-shelf movement? It is a movement that is produced by a different brand than to the one selling the watch itself. It is sometimes of a lesser finished quality and made at a lower cost. Why it's called off the shelf is because the companies that manufacture and sell these movements do not assemble and sell their own watches. Rather, they sell their movements in bulk to companies that would assemble, often making some changes to these base calibers, sometimes decorating the movements, and then sell the watch under their own brand name. ETA, which is owned by the Swatch Group, is the largest producer of Swiss movements in the world, as well as producing other watch parts. Now let's look at in-house movements in detail. Watches with in-house movement tend to be more expensive than their off-the-shelf counterparts. This is not due to the watch company's greed. It is due to the enormous expense involved in researching, fabricating, and testing a movement. It is sometimes beyond the scope of vast majority of manufacturers. Some companies have tried to punch above their weight and tried to come out with their own in-house movements. Now, although they are great movements and it's amazing that some companies are willing to go that extra mile and develop their own in-house movements, but in my opinion, some are struggling with the costs. For example, look at Oris. Now, I'm wearing one and this is just an off-the-shelf movement that has been modified. But they do have their own in-house calibers and they are quite nice. They even have 10 days power reserve. But when the market looks at a brand such as Oris, it doesn't get the same recognition that many other brands might have or enjoy. And when Oris tries to sell watches that are above $7,000 or $8,000, they are really pushing the limits. As a normal buyer that doesn't have much knowledge about watches might lean towards Omega or Rolex in that same price bracket. Now, this doesn't mean that their in-house movements are bad, but it's just that companies such as Oris may struggle in this current volatile market. A friend of mine back in India recently tagged me in this post, which was an ad of Oris selling their in-house caliber watches for more than 50% off. For me, that shows that Oris, at least in some parts of the world, is struggling to sell their in-house calibers, maybe because of the higher price. In-house movements have the benefit of exclusivity. Every brand recognizes the value of the in-house caliber, which explains Swatch Group's takeover of ETA. Citizen recently purchased the movement maker Miyota for the same reason. A homegrown movement is definitely what true enthusiasts prefer. A caliber built by the same brand that has the name on the dial, especially one made exclusively for a particular model, has a great story. Definitely a better story than a watch that would have a movement that is in a number of other cases and from a number of different competing brands. Another advantage an in-house movement has is complete quality control over the entire process. Companies can quality check every single component of the movement as they're the ones designing, manufacturing, and assembling the movements. Manufacturing techniques can be standardized and the materials used at every step. Additionally, most in-house movements are beautifully decorated, so if the watch has an exhibition case back, one can admire the beauty of the movement. Although some off-the-shelf movements are also decorated. Also, just because movements are made in-house doesn't guarantee performance. There are in-house movements that are not necessarily better than the off-the-shelf movements. Perhaps the biggest advantage or motivator for companies to create their own movements is one of supply. When Swatch Group took over ETA, they announced their intention to stop the sale of movements to third-party competitors, ones which were not under their direct control. While other companies have stepped in to fill in the gaps, firms such as Sellita, more and more brands are either creating their own in-house movements or are collaborating with other brands in the industry. For example, Tudor and Breitling. Tudor being given Breitling's B01 to use in their heritage chronograph range, while Breitling receives the 3-hand MT5612 from Tudor for its Super Ocean Heritage 2. This partnership shows that when companies make their own movements, they could also sell those movements to other companies. Now let's look at off-the-shelf movements. Movements produced by suppliers such as ETA and others in Switzerland have more or less a track record of performance and a general understanding of their benefits and limitations. Companies such as ETA focus on only one thing: making watch movements. And ETA has been doing so for well over 100 years. So it definitely is an expert at it. Now that in no way means that ETA produces better movements than other brands' in-house calibers. While brands are trying to come up with their own movements, there is always the possibility that it might be a case of trial and error. And even if they do several tests and quality checks, their first few calibers might face issues. The other reason why off-the-shelf movements are so essential is because without them, we wouldn't have some of the amazing microbrands we see today. Microbrands heavily rely on movement suppliers for the heart of their watches. Because as we have discussed, creating an in-house movement is very expensive. New watch brands simply can't afford to spend that kind of money on movements, and so rely on movement suppliers. Microbrands do not have the budget for an in-house movement, as when they are new, they have to spend money on other things such as design of their watches, marketing, etc. Most of them would also not have the Swiss-made sign on their dial if it wasn't for off-the-shelf movements from Switzerland. Another good thing about off-the-shelf movements is having them serviced is usually a whole lot cheaper than servicing an in-house movement. Finding a freelancer to service your ETA movement isn't difficult. Even your local watchmaker can service it because it's easy to source the parts for it. While technically only a watchmaker who works for or has been authorized by the specific brand has the skills and equipment to tackle an in-house movement. Now, having looked at both in-house movements and off-the-shelf movements, the debate surrounding this topic is not something that can be easily resolved. In my opinion, of course, in-house movements have their own charm and they are more prestigious in some cases, but you cannot deny that we wouldn't have some of the most iconic watches that we have today if it wasn't for off-the-shelf movements. For example, look at the Hoya Monaco. It was a watch that had a off-the-shelf movement. It even had an off-the-shelf case, that as the case was chosen just off a catalog. And for me personally, there are other factors to consider than just whether a watch has an in-house movement or an off-the-shelf movement. Some big brands even use off-the-shelf movements for some of their watches, like IWC. I know the Mark 8 has the off-the-shelf movement, which is Sellita based. And I prefer smaller brands or brands that are not that established using off-the-shelf movements. Brands such as IWC, I understand why they use Sellita-based movements because it is at a more accessible price. But still, at I think it's around $5,000 or $6,000. It's asking quite a lot of money for a off-the-shelf based movement. So I do not like that big brands such as IWC sometimes use off-the-shelf movements and modify them and sell them for a higher price than what you can buy from another brand that is selling a similar movement but much cheaper. So that's my opinion, but let me know what you guys think in the comments down below about this discussion or debate about in-house movements versus off-the-shelf movements. Please do hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and follow me on Instagram at WiningOnTheMove. Until next time, cheers.